The mist in rural Tennessee does not drift. It clings. It settles into the hollows of the landscape like a damp,
white shroud, obscuring the path and muffling the sound of the wind.
Deep within this tangle of ancient timber lies a limestone sentinel that refuses to yield to the passage of time. The Bell Witch Cave. Locals avoid the site once the sun dips below the horizon,
keeping their distance from the jagged, gaping maw of the earth. They know the silence here is not empty, it is expectant.
The stone face of the cave, weathered by eons of rain and subterranean shifts, looms over the forest floor with a weight that defies its size. It is a structure of cold,
unyielding rock that seems to breathe in the surrounding gloom.
No birds nest in the branches near its entrance. No insects buzz in the thick, stagnant air that spills from the deep. The ground here is slick with centuries of mineral deposits, and the darkness inside is absolute.
A heavy, velvet void that swallows light. This place remains a silent witness to secrets buried before the land was mapped,
waiting for the next intrusion into its subterranean domain. The gravel crunched under the tires of the van as it pulled into the overgrown clearing. 5 figures stepped out, their movements crisp and purposeful. The historian checked his watch, the glow of the screen illuminating a map of the limestone network. Beside him, the explorer unpacked a heavy case of thermal sensors and recording gear. They moved with the practiced efficiency of a team that believed in data, in charts, and in the scientific method. They adjusted their headlamps, the bright, artificial beams slicing through the ancient, clinging mist. The crew set up tripods on the slick, uneven ground, their microphones picking up nothing but the distant, rhythmic drip of water from within the earth. They spoke in low, clinical tones, discussing signal strength and battery life, their voices sounding thin and fragile against the towering, silent trees. They worked with total confidence, treating the cave as a geological puzzle to be solved. As the last of the sunlight bled out from behind the tree line, they adjusted their final harness straps. One by one, they stepped toward the threshold, their modern equipment glinting in the dark. They crossed the boundary into the cave, leaving the known world behind them as the first shadows swallowed their lights. A shadow detached itself from the thicket near the trailhead. An elderly resident stood there, skin mapped with deep lines, eyes fixed on the cave entrance. He did not move as the crew approached. He waited until they were within arm's reach, then raised a withered hand to block their path.
"You carry cameras," he rasped, his voice cutting through the damp air like a blade. "You record light."
"But the deep does not care for your machines." The historian paused, adjusting his pack, a thin smile touching his lips. The man stepped closer, his gaze locked on the historian. Those who disrespect the stone hear their own names called from the deep. Turn back before the sun loses its grip. The crew exchanged glances, their shoulders shaking with soft, dismissive laughter. The explorer tapped his thermal sensor, the screen glowing a sterile, mocking blue. "Superstition is just a lack of data," he muttered, stepping past the old man without a second look. They did not notice the resident stepping back into the trees, his face devoid of surprise, only a grim, settled certainty. The crew moved forward, their boots striking the limestone with a rhythm that sounded far too much like a countdown. The threshold was a jagged tear in the limestone, a dark mouth that seemed to inhale the remaining twilight.
Outside, the world was still bathed in a bruised, golden haze. Inside, the air was instantly heavier, tasting of wet silt and stagnant time. The crew moved in a tight formation, their headlamps sweeping the walls in frantic, narrow cones of white light. One by one, they cleared the entrance, the sound of the forest wind dying away as if cut by a knife. The transition was absolute. Behind them, the sky was a shrinking rectangle of gray. Ahead, the tunnel stretched into a blackness that their beams failed to penetrate. The historian reached out to touch the stone wall, his palm coming away slick with cold mineral sweat. He pulled his hand back, wiping it against his side. The temperature plummeted. Their breath began to plume in the air, hanging in the light paths like ghostly, shifting smoke. They stopped for a moment, listening. The rhythmic drip of water intensified, echoing from unseen depths, sounding less like nature and more like a steady, deliberate heartbeat. The silence was not empty. It was pressurized. They turned their heads, scanning the dark, but the light hit only jagged rock and deeper shadow. There was no going back now. The sun had vanished, and the cave had begun to close its teeth.
The team regrouped in a wide, limestone-walled gallery. The floor was uneven, littered with loose gravel that crunched under their weight. The historian pulled out a digital scanner, moving the device slowly along the jagged, mineral-streaked ceiling. Every movement was practiced, efficient, and dictated by the protocols of their profession. They set up tripods, the metal legs scraping harshly against the stone, and adjusted the white balance on their cameras. The chamber was filled with the steady, rhythmic drip of water hitting a stagnant pool somewhere deeper in the dark. It was a monotonous, mechanical sound. They began to document the walls, capturing high-resolution images of ancient, weathered carvings left by early explorers. The historian narrated the process, his voice steady and clinical, detailing the geological formation of the cave with detached precision. He pointed to a fissure in the rock, and the others followed with lights, recording the depth and texture of the stone. For these few minutes, the cave was just a site to be mapped, a collection of data points to be organized into a report. They remained focused on their screens and lenses, ignoring the way the darkness seemed to pool in the corners, waiting for the light to falter. The audio engineer adjusted the gain on his recorder, his eyes fixed on the flickering green levels of the display. He sat on a flat slab of limestone, isolated from the rest of the crew by his headset. A low hiss filled his ears, the standard ambient floor of a deep underground environment. He adjusted the frequency filters,
trying to scrub out the persistent hum of the cooling fans from their gear. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic pulse buried beneath the white noise. It sounded like a breath, held and then released, repeating in a jagged cadence. He frowned,
tapping the side of his headset. He checked the cables, suspecting a loose connection or electromagnetic interference from the nearby equipment. Nothing changed. He increased the volume, leaning forward. The sound shifted,
sharpening into a series of soft, layered whispers that seemed to slide just out of reach. He glanced at the historian,
who was busy documenting the wall carvings, and decided to say nothing. He convinced himself it was merely a harmonic resonance from the wind outside, trapped in the limestone tunnels. He marked the timestamp on his log, noting the anomaly as electronic feedback. But as he looked back at the screen, the waveform spiked again, echoing the cadence of a human voice. He pulled the headset off, rubbing his ears, and stared into the black tunnel behind him. The team finished their scan and turned to follow the secondary passage deeper into the mountain. Character 1 led the way, his map spread out on a flat clipboard, his pen tracing their progress along the main corridor. He stopped abruptly. He looked at the map, then at the tunnel walls ahead, and frowned. The passage that should have been a wide, arching gallery had vanished. In its place stood a jagged, narrow fissure barely wide enough for one person to pass at a time. The stone felt different here, colder, slick with a thick, viscous moisture that coated their gloves. They stepped forward, but the walls seemed to lean inward, pressing against their shoulders. The ceiling dropped, forcing them into a crouch. Behind them, the path they had just walked through was gone, replaced by solid, unyielding rock. The historian turned his light back, but the beam died against a wall that had not been there minutes ago. The air grew heavy, static-charged, and a low, subsonic hum began to vibrate through the soles of their boots. The tunnel pulsed, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction of the limestone, as if the mountain were breathing. Every turn they took led into tighter, more claustrophobic spaces, stripping away their sense of direction and leaving them hemmed in by stone that refused to hold its shape.
The lead investigator tapped the side of his handheld light, but the beam sputtered and died. He pulled a fresh battery pack from his belt, his movements hurried, and slammed it into the housing. The light flickered once.
A weak, dying orange glow, and then vanished into total darkness. Silence followed, save for the frantic clicking of switches.
Nearby, the audio engineer stared at his recorder. The screen was a chaotic scramble of garbled pixels,
the digital levels spiking into the red before flatlining completely. He pressed the power button,
held it, and shook the device, but it remained a heavy, unresponsive brick in his hands. Then,
the compasses began to react. The needle on the historian's navigation tool spun in a blurring, high-speed circle,
refusing to settle on any cardinal point. He tapped the glass, but the needle whipped faster, as if caught in a localized magnetic storm.
The investigator checked his own, finding the same erratic behavior. They were blind.
The mountain had stripped away their maps, their light, and their orientation. Every piece of equipment they relied on was now dead weight,
leaving them huddled in a darkness that felt thick, physical, and absolute.
The only sound left was the ragged, uneven breathing of the crew as they realized the full scale of their isolation. The darkness was not empty. It possessed a weight that pressed against their eardrums. Then came the sound.
It began as a low-frequency vibration, barely audible, felt more in the marrow of their bones than through their ears. It was a hum, deep and resonant, vibrating through the limestone floor. The historian reached out to steady himself against the wall, but he pulled his hand back instantly. The stone was warm, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat that matched the thrumming in the air. It felt like the heartbeat of a massive, buried creature. The hum intensified, turning into a physical pressure that tightened around their chests. Every time the pulse expanded, the air in the corridor seemed to thin. The audio engineer dropped his gear, clutching his head as the vibration rattled his teeth. The rhythm was deliberate, steady, and inescapable. It was not a geological echo. It was a calculated, biological response to their intrusion. The walls seemed to contract, the jagged rock edges shifting imperceptibly with each cycle of the sound. They stood paralyzed, caught in the throat of an entity that was waking up around them. The hum rose in pitch, vibrating through the very air they breathed, until the entire passage felt like a living, breathing lung preparing to exhale.
The vibration grew into a steady, rhythmic throb as they crawled through a narrow fissure that defied their earlier geological surveys.
The historian led the way, his hands scraping against limestone that felt unusually smooth.
Almost polished, they squeezed through a gap that forced them to exhale fully to pass.
The rock pressing against their backs from both sides. Then, the space opened up. They tumbled forward into a large, circular chamber that was not documented on any map or blueprint they carried. The air here was stagnant,
smelling of dry dust and ancient, trapped time. In the center of the room, positioned with deliberate intent,
sat a single, decaying wooden chair. It was the only object in the entire space, facing away from the entrance. The historian shone a weak, manual crank light toward the center, the beam barely cutting through the thick,
settling dust. The chair was splintered, its frame sagging under the weight of years. They stood at the threshold,
paralyzed by the sight of the room. It was not a natural formation. It was a constructed space,
buried beneath miles of stone where no light had touched for centuries. The silence in the room was absolute,
far heavier than the suffocating quiet of the tunnels they had just left. They had stepped outside of the known world. The historian stepped toward the chair, his boots crunching on something brittle. He aimed his light downward.
The floor was littered with the remnants of dozens of candles, their wax pooled into hardened, gray puddles that looked like dried tears.
Surrounding the chair base were heavy iron chains, rusted to a deep, blood-like orange. They were not merely discarded. They were arranged in a tight, concentric circle. The investigator reached out, his fingers hovering over a heavy link. He tapped it. The metal rang out with a sharp, dissonant chime that seemed to vibrate against the walls, lingering far longer than physics should allow. The sound was not hollow. It carried a weight of suffering.
A cold draft swept through the room, though there was no ventilation,
and the smell of ozone and wet iron sharpened instantly. The mood in the chamber curdled. Curiosity vanished, replaced by a sudden, irrational urge to bolt. The historian felt the hairs on his arms rise. It was a primitive,
visceral warning, the kind felt by a prey animal sensing a predator just beyond the periphery of sight. The chains were not just tools of restraint. They were markers of a long,
desperate agony. The air grew heavy, thick with a malice that defied explanation.
They were no longer investigators. They were intruders in a place designed to keep something or someone trapped. The historian swept his light upward, away from the floor, and the beam caught the limestone walls. He froze. Every inch of the rock was covered in text. Thousands of handwritten prayers, etched and inked in countless different hands,
spiraled up toward the dark ceiling. Some were faded, nearly blending into the gray stone,
while others looked remarkably sharp, as if the ink were still wet. The investigator moved closer,
his fingers trembling as he traced the surface. The prayers were not organized. They were frantic, overlapping,
and desperate. "Save me," one line repeated dozens of times. "Let the sun find me again," read another,
carved deep into the limestone. The historian began to read aloud, but his voice cracked. These were not the writings of a single era. He saw dated notations from the 20th century, followed by archaic scripts that predated the state itself. The walls were a graveyard of human desperation, a ledger of souls who had come here begging for release.
The sheer volume of the text was impossible. The cave had been a site of torment for centuries,
a place where people brought their deepest agonies to be consumed by the dark.
The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. This was not a discovery. It was a chronicle of those who had never left.
The historian pulled out his notebook, his hands moving with a mechanical, rehearsed precision. He needed to catalog the findings, to categorize the prayers, to turn this nightmare into data. He spoke into his recorder,
his tone measured and clipped, attempting to strip the situation of its terror.
But the words felt hollow the moment they left his throat. He stopped to check his compass. The needle was not pointing north. It was spinning in a frantic,
blurred circle, vibrating against the glass casing. He tapped it. It didn't stop.
He turned to the investigator, ready to suggest a technical malfunction, but the look on the other man's face silenced him.
The investigator was staring at the wall, his own equipment dead, his digital screen displaying nothing but a garbled,
flickering static. The historian felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind his eyes. The air had changed.
It was no longer just cold. It was heavy, pressing against his skin like deep water.
He looked back at the wall of prayers, and the ink seemed to pulse, the desperate words shifting under his gaze.
His academic resolve fractured. He reached out to steady himself against the rock, but his hand hovered inches from the surface,
afraid to touch it. The cave was not just a place anymore. It was watching them, and it was waiting.
The cinematographer adjusted the gain on his camera, trying to force the lens to pierce the gloom of the back chamber. He kept the viewfinder pressed tight to his eye, his breathing rhythmic and shallow. At the far left edge of the frame, a flicker of movement caught his attention. He panned left, expecting to see a colleague, but the space was empty. He frowned, panning back to the center, when the flicker repeated, this time closer. It was not a trick of the light. It was a shape, tall and indistinct, shifting with a fluid, unnatural grace that defied the jagged terrain. He gripped the camera housing until his knuckles turned white.
"Did you see that?" he whispered, but the others were already distracted.
The audio engineer pulled his headphones off. his face drained of color, as he pointed toward a dark alcove behind them. They all felt it now, the sensation of being tracked. It was a prickling at the base of the neck, a pressure that moved through the air like a localized storm. Every time one of them turned to confront the motion, the air was empty and still. Yet, as soon as they looked away, the periphery of their vision filled with darting, shadow-like figures. They were no longer just observers. They were the prey. The heavy silence of the cave did not last. It began as a low, grating friction, like stone grinding against stone.
But then the tone modulated. It smoothed out into the cadence of human speech.
The audio engineer frantically adjusted his dials, desperate to find a source, but the levels remained flat.
There was no electronic signal. The sound was not coming from the microphones.
It was vibrating directly through the limestone, resonating in their very marrow. One by one, the crew stopped moving. The historian froze, his breath hitching in his throat. A voice, thin and raspy, drifted from the darkness behind him. It was his own name, spoken with an intimacy that made his skin crawl.
He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting a frantic arc through the dust-choked air. Nothing, just the damp,
weeping walls. But the voice repeated it, louder this time, layering over the sound of his own panicked breathing.
The investigator dropped his lantern, the glass shattering against the floor, as he heard a second voice call out from a side tunnel, a voice he hadn't heard in 20 years.
They were no longer just being watched. The cave had found their names, and it was beginning to speak them. The names were only the beginning. The cave did not stop at identification. It began to peel back layers of memory that the crew had spent lifetimes burying.
The historian fell to his knees as the voice of his mother,
dead for a decade, drifted from the cracks in the ceiling. She was not calling his name. She was reciting a date and a location.
A secret he had never confessed to another soul. Beside him, the audio engineer clutched his head, his face twisting in genuine agony as he heard the confession of a failed duty he had long ago scrubbed from his own conscience.
The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of these unearthed realities.
It was as if the limestone itself was extracting their lives, pulling the most jagged,
painful fragments of their identities into the open. They were no longer a cohesive team. They were shattered individuals,
each cornered by an unseen, ancient intelligence that knew exactly which nerve to press.
The investigator tried to speak, to shout a command for them to move,
but his voice died in his throat when the cave whispered back his own darkest regret, word for word. The truth was not a comfort. It was a weapon.
They realized then that their secrets were not hidden. They were the very fuel keeping the darkness alive. The historian reached for his wrist, desperate to measure their time in this suffocating dark. He flicked his flashlight onto the watch face. The second hand was not ticking. It was vibrating in a frantic, rhythmic pulse. Then suddenly, the minute hand began to spin backward with impossible speed. He tapped the glass, but the mechanism had ceased to exist as a tool of measurement. Around him, the others mirrored his confusion. The investigator held up his own digital watch. The liquid crystal display was a chaotic smear of flickering, indecipherable symbols. Then came the shift in perception. A moment that felt like a heartbeat stretched into a hollow, agonizing eternity. The rhythm of their own breathing seemed to slow, dragging out until every inhale felt like it lasted a full minute. The cave was no longer just a place of stone and shadow. It was a void where the linear progression of existence had been severed. They felt the world above, the world of sun and routine, drifting millions of miles away. They were untethered, floating in a pocket of reality that bent to the will of the deep. The historian looked at his companions and realized they were no longer looking at each other, but at ghosts of their own future, trapped in a loop of endless, stagnant time. The heavy silence of the chamber was absolute until it shattered. A thin,
high-pitched wail echoed from a narrow aperture in the northern wall. It was the sound of a small child, crying in distress, muffled by layers of limestone.
The historian gripped his flashlight, his knuckles white, but the sound did not move toward them. It retreated. The investigator turned his head, his eyes widening in the dim light.
He did not wait for a consensus or a plan. He shoved his equipment into his pack and moved toward the tunnel. The others called out,
but their voices sounded flat, drained of all authority by the damp air. The investigator ignored them.
He pressed his palms against the rough stone walls and squeezed through the opening. The crying sharpened,
becoming more rhythmic, more insistent. It was a siren call that cut through his training and his skepticism alike.
He did not look back at the group. He followed the sound, his boots scuffing against the uneven floor.
Moving deeper into the throat of the mountain. The sound of his footsteps grew fainter, swallowed by the porous rock,
until the historian and the others were left staring at the empty, jagged gap in the wall. The wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by a sudden, chilling stillness that felt heavier than the dark itself. The historian and the remaining crew waited. They counted seconds, but the air remained stagnant. No footsteps returned.
No voice called back. The historian stepped to the narrow tunnel opening and pushed his light into the void.
The beam hit only jagged, empty stone. He pushed further, his boots sliding on the wet, slick floor. A few yards in, something glinted in the dust. It was the investigator's heavy-duty camera.
It lay abandoned on the damp limestone, lens pointing toward the ceiling. The historian knelt, his breath hitching in his chest.
He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cold metal casing. There was no sign of a struggle, no scuff marks, no debris, just the camera, left behind in the dark as if the ground itself had simply opened to swallow the man whole.
The historian stood, spinning around, his light cutting erratic arcs against the cave walls. He shouted the investigator's name, but the sound died instantly, absorbed by the porous rock. The panic hit them all at once. They scrambled backward, away from the tunnel, their movements uncoordinated and frantic. The reality of the disappearance settled into the chamber, heavy and suffocating. They were losing people to the mountain,
and the walls seemed to pulse with a low, mocking hum that vibrated in their very marrow. The historian thumbed the playback button on the camera. The screen flickered, struggling to sync, displaying a grainy, monochrome view of a narrow limestone corridor. The investigator stood in the center of the frame, absolutely motionless. His back was turned to the lens, his hands hanging limp at his sides.
He did not breathe. He did not shift his weight. He was a statue carved from the dark.
The crew crowded around the tiny screen, the only light in the chamber. The audio feed crackled with white noise, a rhythmic static that masked the sound of the cave. Then, the static vanished. A voice emerged, raspy, wet, and impossibly close. It did not sound like it came from the recording. It sounded like it came from the air behind them.
You came looking for me. The investigator on screen did not react.
He remained locked in place, a silhouette against the suffocating black. The screen pulsed once, twice, and then the image tore into digital artifacts. The lens hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud. The display cut to black. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than anything the cave had offered before. No one spoke. No one moved. The realization anchored them. They were not alone in the dark.
Panic forced them into motion. They abandoned their gear, grabbed the remaining light sources,
and bolted toward the northern tunnel. The historian led the way, his boots scraping rhythmically against the stone. He counted their steps, keeping a strict rhythm to ensure they were leaving the central chamber behind.
500 paces. 1,000. The corridor narrowed until they were forced to crawl, their hands pressing into the damp,
cold limestone. They pushed forward for 10 minutes, the air growing thick and stagnant. Then, the passage opened up. They scrambled to their feet, ready to see the trailhead, but the light hit a familiar sight. A rotting wooden chair stood in the center of a wide, circular room. Hundreds of handwritten prayers covered the walls. They were back. The historian stared at a jagged scratch he had carved into the rock near the entrance only moments ago.
It was exactly where he had left it. He turned,
looking for the tunnel they had just exited, but the wall was solid, unbroken stone. The cave had folded in on itself.
They began to run again, choosing a different path, sprinting until their lungs burned.
But every tunnel they entered inevitably spat them back into the silent, prayer-filled heart of the mountain. The trap was absolute.
Exhaustion brought them to their knees. They slumped against the limestone walls.
the silence of the cave pressing against their eardrums like physical weight. The candles scattered across the chamber were cold,
their wicks buried in hardened, gray wax that had not seen fire for decades. Then, a sharp, metallic click echoed through the room. It sounded like a flint striking steel, though no one held a tool. A single wick flared. A tiny, blue-tinged flame danced into existence. Before anyone could react, the infection spread. One by one,
the candles surrounding the central chair caught fire. They did not flicker with the golden hue of natural light. They burned with a sickly, pale green luminescence that cast long, distorted shadows against the prayer-covered walls. The historian scrambled back, his hands pressed against the cold stone, watching as the heat began to emanate from the wicks. It was not a gentle warmth. It was an intense, dry heat that smelled of ozone and scorched parchment. The crew huddled together, staring at the sudden illumination. The light exposed every corner of the room, leaving no shadow for them to hide in. The cave was no longer a tomb of darkness. It was a stage, and as the flames steadied, the walls themselves seemed to react to the sudden, unnatural brightness.
The limestone walls began to weep. Dark, viscous liquid seeped from the pores of the rock, tracing lines that defied gravity. The crew watched in paralyzed silence as the fluid arranged itself into jagged, cursive script. It was not mere writing. It was a catalog of their most private failures. The historian stepped forward, his breath hitching in his chest.
A name he had not spoken in 20 years appeared on the surface,
followed by the precise details of a betrayal he had kept hidden from every living soul. Beside him, the audio engineer recoiled, his face draining of color as the wall detailed the exact moment he had compromised his own integrity for money. The words were fresh, glistening with moisture, and they seemed to pulse in time with the low-frequency hum vibrating through the floor. Every secret, every suppressed memory of guilt was being pulled from their minds and etched into the mountain. The cave was no longer just a physical prison. It was a mirror, reflecting their inner darkness with cold, clinical precision. They tried to turn away, to shield their eyes, but the walls continued to bleed, revealing deeper, darker truths that no human should have known. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of stagnant water and old, buried shame. They were being dissected, their defenses stripped away, layer by layer, by an entity that hungered for the wreckage of their lives. The terror was no longer about what lay in the dark. It was about the dark itself.
The historian watched a word on the wall dissolve, not by fading, but by being absorbed into the rock.
The limestone was drinking their secrets. He reached out to touch the surface, expecting cold, hard stone.
But his fingers sank into a warm, yielding texture that felt uncomfortably like muscle. The ground beneath them shuddered.
A deep, rhythmic contraction that rippled through the floor. It was a pulse. The cave was breathing.
Every member of the crew felt it, a heavy, suffocating pressure, as if the mountain were tightening its grip around their very presence. They were not inside a geological formation. They were inside a stomach. The walls shifted, narrowing the chamber, the jagged edges smoothing out into a slick,
pulsating throat. The air grew thick, tasting of copper and bile, making every breath a labor.
They realized then that their fear was not a reaction, but a nutrient. The cave thrived on their panic, drawing their failures into its own structure to sustain its ancient, hollow life. There was no exit, only a slow,
inevitable integration into the mountain. They were the meal, and the cave had only just begun to feed.
The ceiling groaned, a sound of grinding tectonic plates. Dust rained down, choking the air. As the walls began to buckle inward, there was no time for thought, only the primal urge to move.
One of the crew spotted a hairline fracture near the base of the chamber, a sliver of darkness that felt different from the rest.
He lunged for it, fingers tearing at the razor-sharp stone. It was not a crack, it was an opening. He shoved his head into the gap, the rock scraping his shoulders, his rib cage expanding against the unyielding stone. He pulled, kicking blindly at the floor until he dragged his body through.
The second member followed, gasping, hands sliding on the slick limestone.
The corridor was impossibly tight, a jagged throat of rock that seemed to pulse with a final, angry contraction. They crawled, elbows bleeding, knees shredding against the floor, driven by the thunderous collapse behind them. Each inch was a battle against the mountain. They pushed forward into the suffocating dark, lungs burning for oxygen, refusing to look back as the chamber they had just left vanished into a wall of solid,
unmoving rock. They were not escaping, they were being spat out. The final fissure spat them onto the forest floor. They landed in wet leaves, limbs tangled, chests heaving with jagged, rattling breaths. For several minutes, neither moved. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth and pine needles, a sharp contrast to the thick, metallic air of the deep.
One of them rolled onto his back, eyes fixed on the gray, overcast sky. The forest canopy above was a tangled web of branches, struggling to pierce the gloom that still seemed to cling to their skin.
There was no joy in the sunlight, no relief in the open space. The silence of the woods was absolute.
Heavier than the sound of the wind, heavier than the memory of the voices. They sat up slowly, hands trembling, brushing grit and limestone dust from their faces. Every muscle in their bodies burned, a dull, throbbing ache that anchored them to the reality of the morning.
They looked at each other, but did not speak. There were no words for what had vanished behind them.
They were broken, hollowed out by the experience, left to sit in the dirt while the forest indifference swallowed the entrance they had just abandoned.
The cave was sealed, but the silence remained.
Hours after the two survivors crawled from the brush, the local sheriff and a rescue team reached the mouth of the cave. The limestone entrance was jagged, silent, and entirely ordinary under the midday sun. They entered with high-intensity spotlights, expecting to find the remaining 3 members huddled or disoriented within the first few hundred yards. Instead, they found the base camp. A tripod stood perfectly level on the stone floor. 3 heavy backpacks rested against the wall, zippers pulled shut, gear tucked neatly inside. A digital recorder sat on a flat ledge, its red light dark, the internal battery drained to 0. The investigators swept the primary passage, calling out names that echoed into the abyss, but the cave offered no response. They checked the side tunnels, finding only dust and the rhythmic, mocking drip of groundwater. The area was devoid of life. There were no scuff marks on the floor, no torn fabric caught on the limestone, no discarded water bottles or signs of a struggle. It was as if the 3 individuals had simply ceased to occupy space. The searchers stood in the center of the chamber, flashlights cutting through the stagnant air, realizing that the mountain had kept everything but the people. The gear remained, a collection of cold, inanimate objects, while the missing members had vanished into the mountain without leaving a single footprint behind. Months of silence followed the search. The recovered cameras sat in a climate-controlled evidence locker until the forensic team began the tedious process of frame-by-frame review. They expected to find technical errors or final clues left by the missing crew.
Instead, they found something else. A high-resolution monitor displayed the raw footage,
showing the team walking through the dark, limestone tunnels. The lead investigator paused the playback.
He leaned in, pointing at the deep shadows behind the historian. There, standing against the rock wall, was a figure. It was a woman, gaunt and pale, her presence barely distinguishable from the natural contours of the cave.
They scrolled to the next frame. She was still there, shifted slightly to follow the crew's movement. They checked the next hour of tape, then the next. In every single shot, regardless of the angle or the lighting,
she stood in the background. Her hollow eyes were fixed on the group. The team had been surrounded for hours, yet the audio never picked up a footstep, and the crew never once turned to look behind them.
The investigators sat in the quiet, sterile room, staring at the screen as the evidence of a silent, constant stalker filled the frame.
Realization dawning that the footage was not a documentary of a cave, but a record of a hunt.
The lead investigator tapped the keyboard, isolating a single frame from the middle of the expedition. He magnified the image until the woman's face occupied the entire screen. Her features were sharp, drained of color.
And her eyes were not merely empty, they were pits of absolute void. They did not reflect the camera's light.
In the sequence where the historian had walked past, her gaze had tracked him with the precision of a predator.
But as the footage progressed, the realization hit the room like a physical blow. In the later segments,
her head had tilted. She was no longer looking at the crew members who had long since vanished.
She was looking into the lens. She was looking at the forensic technicians. She was looking at anyone who dared to press play.
The team sat back, the sterile glow of the monitors suddenly feeling like a spotlight in a darkened room. Every frame proved that she had been present, patient, and entirely aware of the documentation.
She had not been hiding in the shadows. She had been waiting for the footage to be found. The silence in the laboratory thickened.
They realized then that the cave had never let the team go. It had simply invited the observers to join the hunt.
And now, through the digital gateway of the screen, the pale woman was watching them back.
The final file remained. It was a fragment, barely 10 seconds long, pulled from a camera that had been recovered from the deepest reach of the chamber. The lead investigator signaled the team to stop. He clicked the icon. The speakers crackled to life, but there was no sound, no dripping water.
No distant wind, no hum of the cave's machinery, just a void of absolute, heavy silence that seemed to swallow the ambient noise of the laboratory. The team leaned forward, eyes locked on the waveform,
which remained a flat, dead line. They waited for a glitch, a static pop, or a sign of life. Then,
at the very edge of the recording, the air on the tape seemed to vibrate. A voice manifested. It was not human.
It was thick with a wet, ancient reverb that defied the digital limitations of the microphone.
It bypassed the speakers and seemed to resonate within the room itself. It spoke only 2 words, soft and deliberate, as if addressing a long-awaited guest. Come back. The recording cut to black instantly. In the silence that followed, the laboratory felt colder. The monitor stayed dark, but the sense of being watched persisted, lingering in the shadows of the room long after the screen had gone cold.